Well, scholars say that atheism began in the world around 600 years before Christ. Now, we have to be careful about this because there's a distinction between atheism and non-theism. You may not have ever heard of non-theism, but there is a kind of a careful distinction. This is a new classification. Atheism says there is no God. Agnosticism says there's probably not a God, maybe there's a God, I'm not sure. But non-theism says whether or not there is a God, it doesn't really matter. Our religion's not based on pursuing God. It's something else. And there are two major non-theistic religions in the world. One is Buddhism. You may have known that. And the other is Jainism. And these religions do not posit a creator God, a God over all. Instead, they're more of a inward-reaching religion. So Buddhism, and even Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, is on record of saying, it's not helpful to seek after a creator God. It doesn't really matter. It's not relevant to your life. Instead, you need to turn inwards. You need to have detachment. And that's really what following, the Buddhist religion is about. Jainism also claims to be non-theistic. But in both of Buddhism and in Jainism, there are metaphysical realities, non-physical realities, demigods, beings, angelic type beings that are revered and honored amongst their adherents. So it's not like the atheism that we know of in the West, where they say there is no soul, there are no miracles, there is no God. Instead, it's apathetic or uninterested in the pursuit of a God. So that's really the difference between atheism and non-theism. So sometimes you'll hear people say Buddhism is atheistic. That technically, is kind of true, but now scholars are referring to it as non-theistic. So if you feel like we're just kind of, splitting hairs here, I apologize. I just wanted to put that out at the beginning. But when it comes to atheism as we know it, that is, there is no God, this movement, this idea, bubbles up in the ancient Greeks before Christ. And we're going to look at a few of those fathers of atheism in ancient Greece. So let's take a look right now. So the first atheist is Diagoras of Melos. He's in the 5th century BC, and he's known as the father of atheism. He publicly blasphemed the Greek gods like Zeus, and he encouraged people not to follow after the gods or be inducted into their mysteries. Another prominent early atheist is Theodorus of Cyrene. He's in around 300 BC, and he is supposed to have denied that any of the gods exist, and he wrote a book called On the Gods, which expounded his views in atheism. Around his time, we also have Euhemerus, and he also said that there were no gods, and what we know of as the gods are actually deified rulers and heroes and military heroes of the past, and that these memories have endured into the present, and so the so-called gods that people worship are really just deceased human beings. And the most famous ancient atheist is Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism. And Epicurus taught that reality was completely material. Therefore, there are no gods, there is no single God, there is nothing spiritual or supernatural, there is no afterlife, and that one can find peace in this life by learning to realize that there is no God watching you, there is no divine wrath. Instead, you just need to be true to yourself. And Epicureanism, of course, was a form of hedonism. You need to find pleasure in this life. It wasn't a gross hedonism, it was more of a philosophic pursuit of pleasure. But all the same, it was atheistic and materialistic. So Epicurus, probably more than the others, had the most philosophical approach to his materialistic atheism. Now, soon after that, Christianity swept through the Greek culture, it swept through the Roman Empire, and we really see a disappearance of atheism altogether. Of course, Christian theologians are making arguments for the existence of God, but we don't know or hear of anyone, at least within the West, saying, hey, God doesn't exist. The Trinity doesn't exist. It's not around. We see it creeping up later in the Middle Ages, not in the Christian West, but in the Muslim east. And there's some notable early atheists amongst the Arab thinkers in Islam. We'll take a look at those now. So as early as around the year 900, we have Ibn al-Rawandi, and he declared that Allah did not exist and that Muhammad, the so-called prophet, was a fraud. He was no prophet at all. Obviously, this was not very popular with the Muslims of that time. Also, in the same century, we have Abu Bakr al-Razi. He also denied the existence of Allah. And we have an Arab poet, about 100 years later, named al-Ma'ari. He also denies the existence of Allah. Now, we as Christians may look at this and think, this is interesting because, the advent of atheism after the Christian era begins and originates in Muslim lands. And why is that? Well, we as Christians believe that faith and reason are not opposed. In fact, faith and reason work together. We're not afraid of science, philosophy, or rationality. But in Islam, there is not a real integration of faith and reason. There's no pursuit of philosophy per se in Muslim lands. All there is the Quran and following the teachings of the so-called prophet Muhammad. So Islam is a more fideistic religion based on faith alone. And so we can see that intellectual people begin to see the inconsistencies in the Quran, the inconsistencies in the life of Muhammad, and begin to question organized religion and question the existence of Allah altogether. Now, if we turn back to the Christian West and we look at Europe, and by extension, all the lands that were evangelized by the Catholic Church and by Protestantism, we begin to see that atheism begins to emerge after the Protestant Reformation. Really, when Martin Luther sort of broke the yoke of Catholicism over Europe, he invited free thinking and questioning not only the existence of, say, the sacraments in the church, but the existence of God himself. So let's take a look now at some of these early atheists from the time following the Reformation. In the 1500s, we have accusations of atheism levied against the Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, also against the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and the British playwright and poet Christopher Marlowe. However, these were just accusations. And in my opinion, I think men like Hobbes, Descartes, and Spinoza do tend towards atheism. Spinoza especially seems to equate nature with God and God with nature. So you can see how people were confused and beginning to see these men as atheists. But the first explicit modern atheist was Baron de Holbach. He was in France, and his work in 1770 called The System of Nature explicitly denies the existence of God. Now, de Holbach was an associate of men you might recognize like David Hume, Adam Smith, and notably Benjamin Franklin. However, intellectuals at this time, we're talking late 1770s, were more inclined to deism. Deism is the belief that there's a God, an abstract God who created the universe but has no personal interaction with us and no Bible or divine revelation. Like Benjamin Franklin, he was a deist. So atheism as a movement did not really catch on to the 1800s with the writing of Karl Marx, who died in 1883. And Marx provided the political teeth to atheism. He said religion is the opiate of the masses. Religion is a tool or a weapon that the upper classes use to put down and control the lower classes. Therefore, there's going to be equality. If there is going to be socialism, we need to get rid of religion. Now, just after Karl Marx, we have Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is the one who scandalously proclaimed, quote, God is dead in his book, The Gay Science. And Nietzsche provides a philosophical atheism, and he really is the founder of modern philosophical atheism. And it's after Nietzsche that we start to see a movement moving into the 1900s of explicit atheist apologetics. So, for example, Bertrand Russell, in the beginning of the 1900s, he died in 1970, we start to see apologists who are arguing against Christianity, against the Trinity, against revealed religion. Not just Christianity, but Islam, everything. So in the 1930s, Pope Pius XI begins writing documents against these movements and against these political movements associated with atheism. He writes against Italian fascism, and he writes against atheistic communism. Now, you'll remember in the 1900s, Joseph Stalin begins state-sponsored atheism in Russia. And Our Lady of Fatima prophesied that this would happen back in 1970. She said that Russia would spread her errors throughout the entire world, and that's exactly what Russia did. It spread atheism and communism to China and to Eastern Europe and to the rest of the world in places like Cuba. So in response to this rising global atheistic movement, for example, in the United States, we added the words "one nation," quote, "under God" in 1954 to our Pledge of Allegiance because we saw that atheism and political communism went together. And then in the 1980s, we began to see that atheistic state regimes began to fall. And my opinion is that the revolt against theism in Europe after that time is really a response to the infringement of Islam into European culture. European culture becomes secular, and as Islam begins to take root, more and more people are migrating towards an atheistic belief in order to combat Islam. So that's a kind of a history of Islam in a nutshell. In the next episode, we're going to look at contemporary atheism, militant atheism. These are the professors who are writing books, who are on speaking tours, and are really doing atheistic apologetics against not only Christianity, but also against Islam and Judaism and any sort of religion on the face of the earth. So that's a brief history from before Christ up until today. Look for the next video and we'll talk about contemporary atheism, what they're saying, and how we as Catholics can answer it. Thanks so much. God bless.